Hello. Hi. Welcome to the Daily Bible Reading Show. Feeling kind of lazy today because it's Friday. It's going to be the weekend. So I'm going to read you something I've already written many years ago. So I'm just going to read it out. It's based on Isaiah chapters 3 to 4, and it's called The Gates of Zion. Gates of Zion. Here it is. In this week's study of Isaiah chapters 3 to 4, we find God speaking to the men and women of Zion, confronting each gender with their respective struggles and sins in terms that each could understand. It was picture language, of course. As much of what God said to the men applied to the women as well, and vice versa. But as we learned in the previous chapters of Isaiah, identifying the idols of our hearts, the things which draw us away from a loving God, it's a very tricky thing and it's a very painful thing. How does God do this? Well, what God does is He speaks into our deepest and our darkest fears. In this passage, we keep meeting a phrase, in that day. God says, in that day of judgment, God will pour out His anger on our sin. It's a day when our deepest fears become reality. But you see, it's also a day when God can finally do His work of salvation in us. Not by taking away our dreams, but by fulfilling them more wonderfully than we could ever imagine. So, the first heading is when men are no longer men. So that's the first heading. What is the nightmare scenario for men? It is to lose control. Men are terrified of looking weak, of looking incompetent. Even when we know we are not up to the job, we put on a show or we pass the buck to someone else under the guise of being very humble. You see, the deepest worry of every man, it's not losing his job, it's not losing his money. The nightmare is actually to have that job that comes with all the perks, the car, the office, the business cards. You have that job, but you are absolutely useless at that job. So you walk down the halls and everyone is kowtowing to you, calling you sir, calling you mister. But behind your back, they think you're an idiot. And they make fun of you because of your job that you don't deserve. Isaiah chapter 3 begins with God stripping this city of all its men, all its strong men, all its influential men, all its political leaders, all the intelligentsia, the smart people, and He leaves behind the children. He says, I will make boys their princes. Infants shall rule over them, babies. There's that movie Baby Boss. That's what He's saying, verse 4. But by this, Isaiah does not mean, kids and teenagers are going to rule the city. No, what he means that childish men are going to rule the city. Men who are only good at pointing out other people's problems. They can never find the solutions themselves. Men who are only concerned with their own needs and not the needs of others. Isaiah gives us a picture and a dialogue between two such men, and this is verse 6. For a man will take hold of his brother in the house of his father, saying, you have a cloak, you shall be our leader. And this heap of ruins shall be under your rule. In that day he will speak out, saying, I will not be a healer. In the house there is neither bread nor cloak. You shall not make me a leader of the people. Now, here are two brothers. They're living in their dad's house, and they're shifting. They're shifting responsibility to one another. You deal with the mess, one says. No, it's not my mess. You take care of it. The other replies, and look at the reasons why. The first guy says to his brother, you have a cloak. What he's saying is, you look like a boss. You have the cloak of a boss, like the jacket or the tie, that kind of thing. A lot of us do this even now. We know it's superficial, to choose our leaders based on appearances. But we still want a pastor with a PhD. We still want a CEO who went to Cambridge. We want a guy with the cloak. But then look at the brother's response. In my house, there is neither bread nor cloak. what he's saying? It's saying, I'm not qualified, which sounds very humble. I can't do this job. But in reality, he's telling his brother that he needs a real job. He doesn't have bread. He doesn't have a real job that will pay him enough to feed himself bread. He's got his own problems and he doesn't have time to solve the problems of others. That's what he's saying. So here is a kind of judgment, a picture of judgment on men. And it's not fire, it's not brimstone, it's worse than that. It's the loss of control. It's that frustration of only being able to see the problems but never being able to see the solution. It's that dreadful feeling of uselessness and worthlessness that makes you feel less than a man. That's God's judgment on these men. He strips them of their manhood. And the question is, why? We can understand judgment as wrath, as anger, as pain, though you might disagree with that. At least, that kind of judgment, that makes sense. But why does God judge these men in this very strange way, stripping away their manhood? Because sin means stripping away God of his godhood. This is verse 8. For Jerusalem has stumbled and Judah has fallen because their speech and their deeds are against the Lord, defying his glorious presence. For the look on their faces bears witness against them. They proclaim their sin like Sodom. They do not hide it. Woe to them, for they brought evil on themselves. The expression in verse 9, the look on their faces, is similar to when we say in Cantonese, "bei min." You give face, "bei min." That is, these men were giving face to one another, they were bei min to one another, acknowledging their status, each other's accomplishments, but they do that while ignoring God. The picture here is of men and women sinning against God, but more than that, living their lives independently from God. They couldn't care less what God thought of their deeds, of their actions. Here it says they proclaim their sin like Sodom. They do not hide it. This is the essence of sin. It's rebellion. God is not my boss. It's not my ruler. God has no say. He has no significance. He has no control over my life. I hope you realize that when sin is defined in this way, it doesn't just mean that you're doing bad things, like you're stealing, you're lying, you're killing someone. But this means we can look very, very respectable on the outside while rebelling against God on the inside, in our hearts. Sin means I call the shots. I'm the boss of me. God says one day he will remove all the men of influence. He'll expose sin for what it is. It's that futile attempt of setting ourselves up as mini gods. If you look back to the list of leaders in the beginning of the chapter, you see there among the elders, among the leaders, you see also the soothsayer and the clever enchanter, meaning the men that people in Jerusalem looked up to for leadership. They looked to them for inspiration. They're not just the strong, the smart, the sexy people. They're looking at pagan worshippers who led God's people away from God. Such that when God finally removes these men from leadership, it never crosses their minds to turn to God. What do? They turn to one another. They don't turn to God when the idols are taken away. They turn towards one another. The man says to his brother, you take their place. The men, they still want to be in control. Even in the face of disaster, even in the face of desperation, it never crosses their minds to repent, of their self-sufficiency or to turn to God and to ask him for his help. Man's desire is to dominate at all costs. They must always have the remote control, even though they can never decide what's good on TV. They must keep driving on at full speed ahead, even though the GPS is saying you're going the wrong way. God says to these childish men, one day you will be stripped of your dominion because it is God who gave you that dominion in that first place. It is God who entrusted that dominion into your hands, not for personal gain, not for personal glory, but for God's glory. And one day, even the most stubborn man will have to acknowledge that he is not God. He's not the boss of it all. Only God is. Man's desire is always to dominate, but next, Isaiah speaks to the girls, speaks to the women, whose deepest desire is to be, well, desired. This is the second point, when women are no longer women. And let me see, this is verse 16. The Lord said, because the daughters of Zion are haughty and walk with outstretched necks, glancing wantonly with their eyes, mincing along as they go, tinkling with their feet. Therefore the Lord will strike with a scab the heads of the daughters of Zion, and the Lord will lay bare their secret parts. Now, if every man wants to be the boss, Isaiah reveals to us that every woman wants to be beautiful. If the worst nightmare for man is that one day he will lose all control over his life, then the deepest fear for any woman is that one day she will no longer be loved. God says to the women of Zion that day will come when you will be stripped of all your articles of beauty. Why? Because for these women, it wasn't enough to be beautiful. They wanted to be noticed. Or put it another way, beauty was no longer the end, but a means to an end. Everything about the way they dressed, even the way they walked, said, look at me, look at me, look at me. The women of Zion used their feminine beauty as a tool to gain prominence, to gain attention, even to gain worship. Verse 18. In that day, the Lord will take away the finery of the anklets, the headbands and the crescents, the pendants, the bracelets and the scarves, the headdresses, the armlets, the sashes, the perfume boxes and the amulets, the signet rings and the nose rings, the festal robes, the mantles, the cloaks, the handbags, the mirrors, the linen garments, the turbans, and the veils. Now, the application of these verses is not women can't wear makeup or girls can't wear jewelry or nice clothes. That's not the point. Please don't quote me saying Calvin taught us that all girls must only buy the cheapest, most worn out and tatty clothes from second-hand shops. Maximum 3.99 pounds. That is not the application of these verses. Please do not quote me on that. Why does God say that one day He's going to throw out your entire wardrobe? And let's face it, it's a pretty long and extensive list that we have here. Many of you girls have these very things at home. And in your mind, you might be going, no, my Prada shoes. Nothing is left out of this list, as if to say every single thing will go. Now, why does God say this? Why does God say you have to throw every single thing out of your cupboard, out of your wardrobe, out of your beauty cabinet thing, container, I don't know, makeup counter? because sisters, as much as you might think that these things make you look more beautiful, they don't. Not in God's eyes. You see, as many times as you might like to look in the mirror and say to yourself, you are worth it, dressed in your finest clothes, with your stunning makeup, with your hair done up, as much money as you might spend, as much time as you might dedicate to making yourselves look stunning, it is nothing compared to someone else saying to you, you are worth it. The most beautiful women in the world can be, at the same time, the most insecure. They were the supermodels and catwalk models of their day. These were beautiful women, but it just wasn't enough for them. They had to be always beautiful. They had to be always reminded that they were beautiful. And the more attention that they received, the tragic thing was, the less they believed it. That's why they needed all these accessories, the handbags, the perfumes, the scarves, the headbands, the flowing dresses. These accessories became essential. They might have said, I'm worth it to themselves, But in their hearts they were saying, these things tell me that I am worth it. And God says to these women, the day will come when all your articles of beauty will be stripped away. In fact, on this day of judgment, you won't even want to put on your makeup. Rather, you will dress yourselves in sackcloth. This is verse 24. Instead of perfume, there will be rottenness. And instead of a belt, a rope. Instead of a well-set hair, baldness. Instead of a rich robe, a skirt of sackcloth. And branding instead of beauty. Your men shall fall by the sword, and your mighty men in battle. And her gates shall lament and mourn empty. She shall sit on the ground. Beauty becomes meaningless without a beholder. Loveliness is emptiness when there is no one to love. Why are these women of Zion dressed in sackcloth? Why are their heads shaven? It's not because someone took their clothes away and shaved their heads. No, it's because they are mourning. Their men have fallen by the sword. Their husbands have been killed in battle. Isaiah says, her gates shall lament and mourn, meaning the whole city is in mourning. And the entire city has been stripped of its beauty. The entire city is covered in ashes. She is empty. It's a description of hollowness, worthlessness, even meaninglessness. She sits on the ground, lifeless. Isaiah chapter 4, verse 1. And 7 women shall take hold of one man in that day, saying, we will eat our own bread, we will wear our own clothes, only let us be called by your name. Take away our reproach. I know there are guys who read this and go, cool. 2 girls fighting over me, so cool. But in reality, this is tragic, and this is quite frankly humiliating. 7 women, it's not 2 women, 7 women chasing after one man. Say, oh, you can be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. They don't say to this man, love me, take care of me, protect me. No, these women say, I will take care of myself. I will feed myself, I'll clothe myself. But what they say to this man is, let us be called by your name. In other words, it's a proposal of marriage by 7 women. Now, the guys don't get this. You mention marriage to a guy and he's thinking about how much the wedding is going to cost or how cool it's going to look dressing up like James Bond. No, girls have been thinking, girls, honestly, you think of your wedding day since you were 5 years old. You know what flowers you're going to get, what dress you're going to wear, what color the tablecloth is going to be. And you've thought about the kind of house you're going to live in and how many girls and boys you're going to have as your kids that you're going to raise. Why? Because the deepest desire in a woman is to be desired, is to be cherished, it's to be loved. Here we learn that even in the most desperate of times of judgment, even when the only guy available is a loser who can't provide for these women, who isn't thinking of their well-being but his own selfish gain, these 7 women would rather be loved by a loser of a husband than not to be loved at all. Take away our shame, they say to this one guy. Yet notice as well that earlier, this was the same thing that the man was asking of his brother. He says to the guy, lead us. Take care of this mess. You see, Isaiah, if you see the connection, Isaiah is not describing 2 different nightmares, but he's describing the one and the same. Not 2 situations, but the same worst case scenario, because they lose their identity. They lose their purpose. They lose control. And they come to the point when they recognize that they can't look within themselves, they have to find help that is outside of themselves. Both the men and the women recognize a need that they cannot fill themselves, and they turn to someone outside to fill that need, whether it's for beauty, whether it's for purpose. And it is here that Isaiah speaks of a day, that same day in fact, that these men and women of Zion will finally recognize God as the only one who can give them that significance, that worth, and that affirmation that they're so longing for. And the next point is the branch of the Lord. The branch of the Lord, verse 2. In that day, the branch of the Lord shall be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land shall be the pride and honor of the survivors of Israel. And he who is left in Zion and remains in Jerusalem will be called holy. Everyone who has been recorded for life in Jerusalem, when the Lord shall have washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and cleansed the bloodstains of Jerusalem by its mist, by a spirit of judgment and by a spirit of burning. So it's still describing Zion as the same place. It's still the same people in Zion, the daughters of Zion, though these are the remains of Jerusalem. They're called survivors of Zion. And it's that same day, the day of the Lord. But something has changed very dramatically. These survivors are now filled with pride. They're filled with honor. The branch of the Lord is described as beautiful. Now, in case you didn't get that, these were the two sins of the men and women back in chapter 3. The men were proud of their strength, and their prowess led them to rebel against God. The women were haughty in their own good looks and their beauty, and they wanted to be worshipped more than they wanted to worship God. But these were the same sins which resulted in judgment on the men, judgment on the women of Zion. And yet, pride and beauty characterize the new community, the new redeemed community of Jerusalem. Now, how can this be so? Because in this city, God is the center of their worship. Verse 5. Then the Lord will create over the whole side of Mount Zion and over her assemblies a cloud by day, and smoke and the shining of a flaming fire by night. For over all the glory there will be a canopy. There will be a booth for shade by day from the heat, and for a refuge and shelter from the storm and rain. This is verses 4 and 5. The word for canopy, or kupa, is the Hebrew word describing a wedding chamber, huppah, or the honeymoon suite, or if you like, so that's the honeymoon suite. While the word booth or Sukkoth means tent, especially reminiscent of the tent of God during the Exodus. We've been reading Exodus and Numbers of Leviticus recently and saw these words, the tent. And here's that dual image of wedding and worship. God comes as the true bridegroom of Zion, and he cleanses her by the spirit of fire and judgment, while clothing her with beauty and righteousness. God also comes as the redeemer of his people, pouring out forgiveness for their sins, sheltering them from the heat and the rain. God saves the men and women in the city in such a way that strips them of the idols of their hearts, but at the same time fills their deepest longings and desires with himself. Zion is fruitful again, not a heap of ruins. God takes away the shame and calls them by his name. He calls them holy. And the question I want to end with is this: how do we get this? God's promises are for Jerusalem, but we are here in Cambridge. Isaiah speaks of a future day to come. How can we apply these promises to our lives today? And to answer that, look back to verse 2, because it's packed with clues and descriptions. Isaiah calls this new community the branch of the Lord. And that word branch refers to a family tree, meaning that God will raise up a new people. He calls the survivors those who are a remnant, remainers of Jerusalem. And the reason why Christians can look to these words and know with absolute certainty that they've received these promises is because of Jesus. A Jesus who once turned to his disciples and said to them, "You are the branches." You remember that? It was his last conversation with them before going to the cross. Jesus was on this steady course onto the cross, onto his death, where he would be humiliated, he would be despised and rejected. But he wanted his disciples to know that through his death, they would receive life. Through his humiliation, they would receive glory. And Jesus said this is John 15, verse 5, I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers, and the branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. But if you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. Now Jesus says to us, I am the vine, you are the branches. And he calls us to remain in him, to remain in him. He's calling us to find our deepest satisfaction, our truest joy in nothing else and no one else but him. Apart from Jesus, we wither and die. But in Jesus, we find life, purpose, joy, righteousness, peace, love. And the reason why Jesus chose to say these words on that day was because that was the day he would take our shame, our rejection, our sin on the cross. Jesus took God's punishment for sin on our behalf. It was that same day. It was that same event. Both judgment from God and salvation through God's Son, Jesus Christ. And Isaiah was speaking about this day, a day when our deepest fears would come to life. God would pour out all his anger of our sin. He will expose all the shame of our sin on this day. Yet Christians know that on this day, Jesus took the penalty of our sin and offers us that forgiveness, that reconciliation, and that life. And that's what we see on the cross. That's why we keep coming back to the cross, to see our sin, to see our God, to see our Savior, Jesus Christ. This is Isaiah 53 and verse 4, and I'll close with these verses. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and by his wounds we are healed. This is Isaiah chapters 3 to 4, the gates of Zion.